Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. Eitan and Ruth, an Oxford love story. The soul of Oxford in late autumn was a melancholic inhalation of decay, the sweet fungal scent of fallen leaves dissolving into damp earth, the sharp perfume of rain on ancient, indifferent stone. It was a city of ghosts, and Ruth Adler felt their chill in her bones. An American adrift in a sea of hushed reverence, she found the university's grandeur less inspiring than oppressive. Its halls, built for the certitude of centuries, seemed to mock her very modern, very private state of intellectual and emotional confusion. She was a scholar of questions in a world that seemed to trade only in prescribed answers. It was this feeling of being unmoored that led her to a sparsely populated lecture on medieval Jewish philosophy, held in a forgotten room in a lesser-known college. The air was thick with the brittle aroma of old paper and beeswax. Sunlight, thin and golden as spun sugar, slanted through a high, mullioned window, illuminating dancing motes of dust. She took a seat at the back, expecting little more than a dry recitation of historical facts, a way to pass an evening that threatened to stretch into an eternity of loneliness. Then he began to speak, and the air in the room changed. His name was Eitan Halberstam. He was Israeli, the introduction had noted, a visiting lecturer of some renown. He was a man built of quiet contradictions. Tall and spare, with the stoop of a lifelong academic, he possessed a stillness that bordered on sorrowful. His dark hair was threaded with premature grey at the temples, and his face, handsome in a severe scholarly way, was etched with lines of a grief that seemed too old for his years. Yet when he spoke of Maimonides, the 12th century sage, his voice, though low, was imbued with a contained, smouldering passion. It was as if he held a fire in his cupped hands, careful not to let it burn him. Ruth leaned forward, forgetting the cold, the ghosts, the weight of her own displacement. He was not merely lecturing, he was wrestling with the text, pulling it from the dust of history into the unstable light of the present. He spoke of the Guide for the Perplexed, not as a static theological treatise, but as a living, breathing map of doubt. After the lecture, as the handful of attendees shuffled out with polite nods, Ruth remained in her seat. A question had taken root in her, a seed that his words had watered. These halls felt so cold, so full of ghosts, who spoke a language I couldn't understand, she thought. And then he spoke, and it was as if he'd given a voice to my own silent questions. She gathered her things and approached the front of the hall, where he was carefully placing his notes into a worn leather briefcase. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a small cage. "Dora Halberstam?" He looked up. His eyes were a deep, complicated brown, and for a moment they held the guarded look of a man accustomed to being left alone. "Yes? I'm Ruth Adler. I'm a doctoral student from New York." She felt a blush creep up her neck. "I hope this isn't an imposition, but your lecture, you spoke of the deliberate contradictions in Maimonides." He gave a slight formal nod, his gaze sharpening with professional interest. "I did. You presented it as philosophical necessity, a way to speak to both the simple believer and the sophisticated thinker. But I wondered," she hesitated, then plunged ahead, "I wondered if it wasn't also a spiritual one, a reflection of our own internal state. How can one have faith in a world that is so full of inherent contradictions, beauty and cruelty, order and chaos, unless God himself is found precisely in that tension, in the struggle, not in the resolution?" He went utterly still. His hand, which had been about to close the latch on his briefcase, rested on the worn leather. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the professional veil dropped. She saw something flash in his eyes, not surprise but a profound, startling recognition. It was as if she had spoken a password to a secret society of which they were the only two members. He gestured toward a massive leather-bound volume on the lectern, its pages the colour of old cream. The texture of its cover looked as brittle and fragile as ancient history itself. That, he said, his voice softer now, losing its lecturer's formality, is the very heart of the matter. The contradiction is the point. He met her eyes, and the space between them became charged, electric. The low amber light from the single desk lamp seemed to pool around them, separating them from the rest of the darkening room. It is where God allows us to find him, in the space between what is written and what is felt. He held her gaze for a beat too long, a silent acknowledgement of a shared language. In that moment, an entire conversation passed between them, one of loneliness, of seeking, of a mutual understanding that ran far deeper than the text they discussed. The air vibrated with it, a low hum of connection. Then, as if catching himself, he blinked. The mask of polite distance slid back into place. He snapped his briefcase shut with a decisive click. "A very astute observation, Miss Adler. Thank you for attending." He gave her another curt nod and turned, his footsteps echoing on the old wooden floor as he walked away, leaving Ruth standing in the amber light, the scent of rain on stone suddenly sharp in her nostrils, her world subtly, irrevocably tilted on its axis. Their subsequent encounters began with the curated randomness that academic life affords. A shared table in the cavernous silence of the Bodleian Library, a nod across a quadrangle slick with rain. These meetings were cloaked in the guise of intellectual discourse. They would debate the Kabbalistic interpretations of creation or the influence of Aristotle on Jewish thought, but beneath the surface of their words, another conversation was taking place. It was in the way his eyes would soften when she made a point he admired, or the way her breath would catch when he leaned closer to trace a line of text in a book they were sharing, his finger hovering just above the page. One grey, misty afternoon, he suggested they walk. The air was thick and damp, blurring the hard Gothic edges of the colleges and muffling the distant chime of a chapel bell. They followed the path along the River Cherwell, the water a sheet of polished slate, carrying a flotilla of fallen leaves. A single bright red one caught her eye, a splash of vibrant life on the sombre, flowing water. For a long while they walked in a comfortable silence, a quiet communion that required no words. Then, as they watched a punt glide by, its pole stirring the murky depths, Eitan spoke, his voice low. "My wife. She was an archaeologist. She loved this fog." He said it to the river, not to Ruth, his gaze fixed on the opposite bank. She used to say that history wasn't in the artifacts themselves, but in the spaces between them, the missing pieces. She said the fog did that to the city. It hid the solid things and forced you to see the shapes in between. It was the first time he had mentioned a wife. The word hung in the air, heavy and real. Ruth's heart clenched, not with jealousy, but with a sudden aching understanding of the sorrow he carried. She didn't offer facile condolences. Instead, she honoured the raw intimacy of the confession with her own. "I think that's what I've been looking for," she said softly. "Not just in my dissertation, but in everything. A unifying theory. Something to make sense of the missing pieces in my own life. It's why I came here. I thought I'd find it in the architecture of old ideas, but instead I just feel unmoored." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were unguarded, filled with a shared melancholy. "I am beginning to understand what she meant," he said, and the she was a ghost between them, but for the first time it was a gentle one, not a barrier. Their next meeting was in a cramped, book-lined tea shop off the high street, a haven of warmth against the encroaching chill of late November. The air smelled of steamed milk and old paperbacks. He brought a book for her, a slim, rare volume on Maimonides' esoteric teachings. "I thought this might interest you," he said, pushing it across the table. When she opened it, she saw it was his personal copy. The margins were filled with his faint pencil annotations, elegant script that was as much a query as it was a statement. Questions, corrections, little arrows connecting disparate ideas. It was a map of his mind. Sharing it was an act of profound trust, a gesture of intellectual intimacy that felt more significant than any physical touch. She looked up at him, the shared warmth of the teapot a tangible thing between their hands. "Eitan," she began, using his first name for the first time. It felt both natural and momentous. "Ruth," he replied, and the simple sound of her name in his mouth was a quiet affirmation. She spent that night in her small, cold room, not reading the book's printed words, but his. She traced the faint graphite lines with her fingertip, a shiver running through her. "His thoughts are here, on the page," she mused, a slow, deep ache spreading through her chest. "It feels more intimate than a touch. It feels like a soul." The distance between New York and Oxford, between student and lecturer, between his grief and her searching seemed to dissolve in the quiet act of reading his mind on the page. The first breath of true winter swept through Oxford, stripping the last defiant leaves from the trees and leaving their skeletal silhouettes stark against a steel-grey sky. The melancholy beauty of autumn curdled into a harsher, colder reality, and with it the easy warmth between Ruth and Eitan began to leach away. The catalyst was a letter, thin and blue, bearing an American postmark. It lay on Ruth's desk like a summons. Her university in New York had confirmed the date of her required return, outlining a rigid schedule for her doctoral defense. The abstract notion of her departure, once a distant haze on the horizon, now had a date, a time, a stark finality. It was in 6 weeks. The words seemed to rearrange the very molecules in the air, making it harder to breathe. She didn't tell Eitan about the letter, but he seemed to sense the shift in her. A new distress hummed just beneath her skin, and he, a man preternaturally sensitive to the nuances of sorrow, responded not by drawing closer, but by retreating. It was a strategic withdrawal into the cold, safe territory of his work. Their meetings, which had become the anchors of her week, grew strained. The comfortable silences were now filled with a tense, unspoken weight. The flow of conversation, once a rushing river, became a trickle, meandering around safe academic subjects. He was Dr. Halberstam again, and she was Ms. Adler. They were 2 scholars in a library, nothing more. The change was a constant dull ache in Ruth's chest. The silence between them in a crowded, buzzing common room was more profound and deafening than the hush of the Bodleian had ever been. She felt as though she were watching him recede down a long corridor, growing smaller and more distant with each passing day. Finally, she could bear it no longer. She caught up with him after a seminar, in a stone-flagged passage that echoed with the footfalls of departing students. The chill of a stone wall seeped through the thin wool of her coat as she stood before him, blocking his path. "Eitan." He stopped, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Ruth, was there a point in the seminar you wish to clarify?" His tone was polite, formal, and it cut her more deeply than any harsh word could have. "No," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to clarify this. Us. What is happening?" She took a breath, summoning her courage. "I don't understand. We were talking, really talking. Now it feels as if we're standing on opposite sides of a locked gate. Did you lose the key, or did you choose to throw it away?" His gaze finally lifted to meet hers, and she saw a flicker of the man from the riverbank, the man from the tea shop, his eyes full of a pain he was trying so desperately to contain. He looked away toward the grey, unforgiving sky visible through a high window. "The key was never mine to give," he said, his voice quiet and rough. He confessed then, not in a torrent, but in spare, clipped sentences that felt like stones being dropped into a deep well. He spoke of his grief not as a wound that was healing, but as a country he now inhabited, a place with immutable borders and a permanent population of one. My world has finite borders now, he said, turning back to her. The agony in his expression was so naked it made her want to look away. I cannot ask you to live in such a small country. It would be a cruelty to let you believe I could offer you anything more than these fleeting conversations. To pretend otherwise would be a lie, and we have been nothing if not honest with each other. The words were meant to be a kindness, a gentle severance, but they felt like a judgment. He was closing a door she hadn't even realised she'd been hoping to walk through. The careful, formal politeness he wrapped around his confession was worse than a heated argument. It was a dismissal. I see, she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She stepped aside, clearing the path for him. I am sorry, Ruth, he murmured, and the genuine regret in his voice was the most painful part of all. He walked past her, his footsteps echoing down the cold corridor until they faded, leaving her alone with the chill of the stone against her back and a silence that was absolute. A storm born of the Atlantic had hurled itself across England and now beat against Oxford with a wild, relentless fury. Rain lashed the leaded glass of Eitan's college rooms, and the wind howled in the chimneys like a tormented spirit. The turmoil outside was a pale reflection of the tempest inside Ruth. It was her last night. Her flight was in the morning. She stood outside his door, the rare book he had lent her held tightly in her hands. Returning it was to be a final, formal act of closure, a neat tying off of a thread that had frayed into painful silence. She raised her hand to knock, the book a cold, hard shield against her chest. He opened the door, and for a moment they simply stood there, the pretense of formality, a fragile skin stretched taut between them. He looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed, the firelight from within his study catching the silver in his hair. You're leaving, he said. It wasn't a question. In the morning, she confirmed, holding out the book. I came to return this. He took it, their fingers brushing. The contact was an electric shock, arcing across the cold space that had grown between them. He didn't step aside to let her in, nor did he close the door. They remained in the liminal space of the doorway, the storm raging around them. The storm is terrible, he said, his voice rough. You shouldn't walk back in this. Come in. Wait for it to pass. One last glass of whiskey. It was an appeal, not a polite offer. She nodded, a single sharp movement, and stepped inside. His study was his sanctuary, a world walled in by books. They lined every surface, piled on the floor, their spines a mosaic of faded gilt and dark leather. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, peat smoke from the flickering fire, and whiskey. The firelight cast huge, dancing shadows that made the room seem both a fortress and a cage. He poured them each a glass, the amber liquid catching the light. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. The whiskey burned a welcome path down her throat. Finally she spoke, her voice raw. You hide in here, don't you? You build walls of books and theories and you call it grief, but it's fear. You're hiding from life. His head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a sudden defensive anger. And what would you know of it? You with your theories and your youthful confidence. You romanticize a pain you cannot possibly understand. You look at my life like it's one of your texts, something to be analysed and solved. I look at you like you're a man She cut herself off, unable to say the word. A man I care for, who is choosing to entomb himself alive. Is that what she would have wanted? The archaeologist? For you to stop digging, to stop searching? The argument was the spark thrown into the tinder of their pent-up frustration and longing. It escalated quickly, their voices rising over the shriek of the wind. Accusations became confessions. Anger melted into desperation. You don't know what you're asking of me, he shot back, his control shattering. He slammed his glass down, whiskey sloshing over the rim. "I am a landscape of ruins, Ruth. Do you hear me? There is nothing left to build with." "Then let me be a ruin with you," she cried, tears finally breaking free, tracing hot paths down her cold cheeks. "Don't you see, I don't want your perfection, I want your contradictions. I want the man who understands that faith is found in the struggle. I want you." The words hung in the air, a raw, undeniable truth. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a devastating vulnerability. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "Ruth," he whispered, his voice broken. He kissed her then, and it was not gentle. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was like he was trying to solve an unsolvable question, his mouth searching and hungry on hers. It was the culmination of every unspoken thought, every shared glance, every painful silent moment. The argument died on their lips, replaced by the raw, irrefutable language of need. His tweed jacket was rough against her cheek as she pressed into him, her hand sliding from his shoulders up into his thick hair, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to him. It was a kiss of fire and fragility, a dance of profound longing and heartbreaking tenderness. When their bodies pressed together, the length of him hard against her, it was an answer, not to the future but to the overwhelming, painful present. His hands, shaking slightly, moved from her face, tracing the curve of her back, his touch both a plea and a surrender. Shivers racked her body. He broke the kiss only to murmur her name against her lips, a prayer in the firelit quiet. With a shared, ragged gasp, they began to shed the layers that separated them, the buttons of her coat, the knot of his tie, the hooks of her bra, all clumsy, urgent impediments. Clothes became a frustrating impediment, a barrier to the truth they both desperately needed. Fabric whispered to the floor, a tide of wool and cotton at their feet, until there was nothing left but the heated rush of skin meeting skin. The air itself seemed to crackle, charged with a current that ran from his fingertips to her soul. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his touch reverent, and carried her the few feet to the worn Persian rug before the fire. The heat of the flames licked at her back as he laid her down, his body covering hers not as a weight, but as a promise. He looked down at her, his eyes dark with a mixture of reverence and a raw, untamed hunger. The firelight sculpted the planes of his face, casting shadows that danced and deepened. Her gasp turned into a soft moan as his hands began a slow, deliberate exploration. He touched her as if he were a blind man learning a masterpiece by feel, as if he were memorizing the very essence of her. His fingers traced the elegant curve of her hip, the sensitive line of her back, the hollow of her throat where her pulse beat a frantic rhythm against his lips. She arched into his touch, a silent plea and a fierce acceptance all at once, her own hands roaming the hard, tense muscles of his back, his shoulders, pulling him closer into the inferno. This was a place beyond intellect, beyond words. This was the country of the body, a wild and uncharted territory they were discovering together, guided only by instinct and a soul-deep ache of longing. There was a shift, a deepening, a final breathless surrender, as 2 bodies became one current, moving in a rhythm as old as the storm lashing the windows. The world dissolved into heat and shadow, the frantic beat of 2 hearts, and the overwhelming sensation of being utterly, finally found. They clung to each other in the flickering firelight, 2 souls who had finally erased the distance, finding a desperate, beautiful and profound solace not in words, but in the undeniable truth of the flesh. The storm passed in the deep hours of the night, leaving a profound, baptismal silence in its wake. Morning arrived not with a triumphant sun, but with a soft, pearlescent grey light that filtered through the rain-washed windows of Eitan's study. It was a world made new, clean and quiet. They awoke on the rug before the cold hearth, tangled in each other, and a stray blanket he had pulled over them at some point. For a long time they didn't speak. The academic pretense, the roles of lecturer and student, the armour of grief and the shield of intellect, all had been burned away in the night's fever. What was left was something simpler, more fragile and infinitely more real. A man and a woman in the quiet aftermath. He stirred first, propping himself up on an elbow to look at her. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his touch tentative, as if he were afraid she might vanish. She opened her eyes and met his gaze. There was no artifice left in him, only a deep, tremulous honesty. He didn't speak of the future, of her flight, of the impossible logistics that separated them. Instead, he stood, unabashed in his nakedness, and went to make coffee. The simple domestic act was more intimate than anything they had yet shared. He returned with 2 steaming mugs, and they sat together on the floor, the blanket wrapped around their shoulders, the taste of strong black coffee chasing away the last ghosts of the night. Later, as she was dressing, pulling on her clothes in the soft morning light, the unspoken question, "What now?" hung in the air, heavy and fragile. The silence was no longer tense, but it was filled with the enormous weight of the Atlantic Ocean and the thousands of miles that would soon separate them. Eitan, who had been watching the quiet street from his window, turned and walked to his desk. His movements were deliberate, thoughtful. He took out 2 small, stiff cards from a drawer and uncapped his fountain pen. The scratch of the nib on the card was the only sound in the room. He wrote his address, his name, his college, Oxford, in his elegant, scholarly script. He walked over to her and held the card out. "So you know where to find me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Ruth's fingers trembled slightly as she took it. The card felt solid, real, a tangible piece of her future. It was an anchor. Then he offered her the fountain pen and the second blank card. "And you, Ruth," he said softly, "so I know where to find you." It was a request, but it felt like a vow. She took the heavy pen from him, its weight familiar and comforting. On the blank card she wrote her own name and her address in New York. The simple act felt monumental, a formal pact made in the quiet of the morning. They were no longer 2 separate people defined by his past and her imminent departure. They were 2 points on a map, and they'd just drawn the first line between them. She handed him the card and their fingers brushed. He looked down at her handwriting, then back up at her, a look of profound, settled determination in his eyes. He carefully slid the card into the breast pocket of his shirt, placing it over his heart. "Good," he said, a small, genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. "Now we can continue our conversation." He insisted on walking her to where her taxi would be waiting. The streets of Oxford smelled of wet earth and clean air. The stone of the colleges seemed less imposing, softened by the damp, its grey hues richer in the morning light. Their conversation was simple, practical, about the time, the traffic, the weight of her luggage. Yet every mundane word was heavy with unspoken meaning, a testament to the new reality between them. The black cab was waiting at the corner of the lane, its engine a low thrum in the quiet morning. This was it, the moment of separation. But as she moved to open the taxi door, he took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, holding fast. The emotional barrier that had stood between them for weeks was gone, replaced by a tangible, physical connection. "You will write," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a command, a plea. "I will write," she answered, her voice steady. He leaned in and his mouth found hers. This kiss was a stark, stunning contrast to the storm of the night before. There was no desperation in it, no hunger, only a profound and certain tenderness. It was a kiss of quiet promise, a long, deep and searching affirmation in the crisp morning air. His other hand came up to gently trace her jawline. his thumb brushing the corner of her lip as if to seal the promise there. "Be safe, Ruth," he whispered against her mouth. It was a benediction. He opened the taxi door for her. She slid in, her eyes never leaving his. He held her gaze as he closed the door, his hand resting on the window for a moment before he stepped back. As the taxi began to pull away, she watched him grow smaller, a solitary figure standing against the backdrop of ancient stone. But he was not a ghost anymore. He was a man, solid and real, anchored in the hopeful light of a new day. The logistical chasms, the ocean, the continents, the careers, remained, but they no longer felt like reasons to remain apart. They were merely problems to be solved. For two unfinished lives, grappling with the contradictions of the past and the uncertainties of the future, this was not an end. It was a difficult, fragile, and exquisitely beautiful beginning. Chords of a different song. The grand drawing room of the Ellison home in Bronzeville was a testament to a life meticulously arranged, each element a note in a carefully composed symphony. Polished mahogany gleamed under the soft glow of sconces, reflecting the muted floral patterns of the Persian rug. The air, perpetually perfumed with the delicate, almost mournful scent of lily of the valley, seemed to stifle any errant breeze, holding it captive within the stately confines. Viola Ellison, seated with an impeccable posture befitting her classical training, felt the familiar weight of these surroundings settle upon her, a silken shroud of expectation. Her fingers, long and graceful, twitched imperceptibly, as if yearning for the cool, crisp ivory of the piano keys, a realm where order reigned supreme. Tonight, the conversation, like the room itself, was perfectly orchestrated. Her fiancé, Julian Vance, a man whose ambition was as sharp and undeniable as his perfectly tailored suit, held court. His voice, calm and assured, resonated with the unwavering conviction of a rising NAACP leader discussing civil rights strategies. "Our path is clear, Viola," he articulated, his gaze sweeping over the gathered guests, prominent members of the black community, all echoing his earnest dedication. Discipline, dedication, and an unshakable adherence to the standards we uphold. It is the only way forward to demonstrate our worth, our capability. Viola nodded, a practice gesture, her mind adrift. The words were righteous, important, a melody she had been taught since childhood. Yet, a disquiet hummed beneath her composure, a faint dissonance in her soul. It was during a brief lull, as a new round of drinks was served, that Julian's colleague, a man whose respectability was only surpassed by his stiff-necked disapproval of anything outside the established order, cleared his throat. "One hears of these new establishments," he began, his tone laced with distaste. "These underground jazz clubs springing up in less reputable parts of town. Just noise, of course. A distraction from the real work." He dismissed it with a wave of his hand, as though swatting away an annoying fly. Noise, a distraction. Viola felt a flicker of curiosity ignite within her, a forbidden thought, an audacious spark in the carefully banked embers of her existence. The word noise echoed in her mind, not as a condemnation, but as a thrilling possibility. The piano keys were an extension of her very soul, each note a perfect, predictable harmony. Yet, tonight, a different music called to me, a discordant, dangerous siren song that promised chaos, and perhaps truth. Days later, the quiet rebellion within her could no longer be contained. A thirst for something raw, something untamed by the strictures of her life propelled her. Under the guise of an evening stroll, Viola secretly ventured to the address whispered by Julian's colleague. The jazz club was tucked away down a dimly lit alley, a defiant pulse in the heart of the city. The moment she stepped inside, the world shifted on its axis. The air was a tangible entity, smoky and thick with the scent of whiskey and unspoken desires. Laughter, loud or unrestrained, mingled with the clinking of glasses and the insistent driving rhythm of a bass line. It was chaos, glorious and alive, a stark contrast to the polite, hushed conversations of her drawing room. Her eyes, still adjusting to the dimness, were drawn to the stage. There, bathed in the singular glow of a spotlight, stood a man with a saxophone, Samuel Cohen. His name, she would learn later, carried the quiet weight of tradition, yet his music was anything but. The saxophone was a living extension of him, a gleaming, brassy soul pouring out melodies that were both mournful and exhilarating, a wail of longing one moment, a joyous shout the next. He swayed, his eyes closed, lost in the intricate dance of notes, his whole being infused with the raw emotion of the music. And then, as if sensing her presence, his eyes opened. They were dark and intense, and they met hers across the crowded, swirling room. It was a moment of startling recognition, as though a chord had been struck deep within her that she had never known existed. The world shrank, the surrounding clamour fading into a distant hum. His lips, still curved from the last lingering note, parted in a brief knowing nod, a silent acknowledgement that transcended words. In that instant, amidst the smoky haze and the forbidden music, Viola felt a stirring of something entirely new, something dangerous and utterly compelling. The crisp, cool feel of piano ivory, her world of perfect harmony, suddenly felt brittle, while the smooth, warm brass of his saxophone promised a different kind of truth. A broken classical sheet music page, forgotten on her piano at home, seemed to symbolize the unraveling of her old life, while the smoky, whiskey-tinged air of the jazz club breathed new life into her lungs. The clandestine corners of Chicago's jazz scene became Viola's sanctuary, a stark counterpoint to the formal elegance of her Bronzeville home. The lily-of-the-valley scent of her drawing room gave way to the intoxicating aroma of stale cigarette smoke and the faint, sweet trace of cheap perfume that clung to the velvet banquettes of the club. The tone of her life, once a measured andante, was becoming a hushed allegro, filled with the thrill of transgression and the burgeoning passion she found in Samuel Cohen's presence. At first, her excursions were cautious, tentative. She would slip away after her family retired, her footsteps hushed on the grand staircase, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She would sit in a dimly lit corner of the club, a ghost in the vibrant tapestry of the night, simply to listen. But her gaze, intense and unwavering, always found Samuel on stage. He in turn began to seek her out in the fleeting moments between sets. Drawn by the quiet intensity in her eyes, he would approach, a shy smile playing on his lips, the saxophone still warm from his touch slung casually over his shoulder. Their conversations began with music, a shared language that transcended their disparate worlds. He spoke of jazz not as mere notes on a page, but as a living, breathing entity, a spontaneous expression of the soul. "Music, Miss Ellison," he'd murmur, his voice a low, melodic rumble that sent shivers down her spine, "isn't about rules. It's about feeling. It's about breaking free." Viola, accustomed to the rigid structure of classical compositions, found herself captivated by his philosophy. She spoke of her own reverence for the masters, the mathematical precision of Bach, the soaring emotion of Chopin, but confessed, "My whole life I've played the notes perfectly, but what if the song itself is wrong for me?" He listened, truly listened, his dark eyes discerning, seeing past her polished exterior to the yearning beneath. "There's a fire in you, beneath all that calm," he observed, his voice soft, almost a whisper. I hear it in the way you listen. These exchanges deepened, spilling over into late-night phone calls. Viola would wait until the house was silent, the last echoes of her mother's clinking teacups long faded. Huddled under a blanket in her room, a stolen moment of rebellion, she would listen as Samuel unveiled his world. He spoke of his family's history, of their journey to Chicago, of the quiet prejudices he faced, even within the city's seemingly diverse landscape. He shared his struggles to gain recognition, the relentless pursuit of his art in a society that often deemed it a novelty, or worse, a vice. In turn, Viola found herself revealing the stifled dreams she harboured, the crushing weight of her family's expectations, the gilded cage her life had become. Each whispered word, each shared glance was a thread weaving a tapestry of forbidden longing. It felt both terrifying and utterly irrevocably right. One rainy evening, the insistent rhythm of jazz drums still vibrating in her ears, Samuel walked her part of the way home. The city hummed around them, a symphony of distant traffic and falling rain. The cool, smooth feel of the rain on her skin was a balm, a cleansing sensation that washed away the day's polite falsehoods. There was a silent understanding passing between them, a recognition of a bond that defied logic or convention. As they reached the corner of her street, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows, he stopped. Without a word, he gently took her hand, his fingers warm and strong against her own. The simple touch was a spark, igniting a fierce, undeniable attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface. It was a silent promise, a dangerous invitation to a world where music truly was about breaking free, and where the most illicit coffee shared in a dimly lit diner tasted sweeter than any grand feast. The walls of Viola's carefully constructed life began to show hairline cracks, each one a testament to the fragile intimacy she was cultivating in secret. The grand, unyielding architecture of society clashed ever more fiercely with the tender, clandestine world she shared with Samuel. The tone of her days grew increasingly tense, punctuated by moments of fear, guilt, and the suffocating pressure of external forces. Julian, with his keen eye for detail and his unwavering focus on their shared future, was the first to notice. It wasn't suspicion, not yet, but a subtle shift in her demeanour, a growing distraction that perturbed him. Her usual attentiveness had wavered during discussions of fundraising and community outreach. He confronted her one evening, his voice calm yet tinged with an almost paternal concern. "Viola," he began, his hand resting lightly on her arm, a gesture of ownership. "We have a purpose. Distractions, no matter how appealing, only serve to derail us. Our family, our community, they depend on us to uphold certain standards, to be exemplars." The clinking of ice in crystal glasses at a formal party, cold and brittle, seemed to underscore his words, chilling her to the bone. Soon, whispers began to circulate within the Bronzeville community, insubstantial at first, like smoke, then growing in density. Disapproving glances followed Viola at church. Hushed conversation ceased abruptly when she entered a room. The veiled judgments were a tangible weight, the oppressive presence of a fur stole draped too heavily over her shoulders. Her late-night excursions, once discreet, now seemed to broadcast themselves on the wind. Simultaneously, Samuel's world faced its own pressures. His club, a haven of vibrant expression, found itself under increased scrutiny. Conservative elements of the city, ever vigilant, viewed jazz, and particularly spaces where black and Jewish artists and patrons mingled, as a corrupting influence, a moral decay that threatened the fabric of society. Threats, thinly veiled at first, then more overt, began to circulate. The wail of a police siren in the distance, a common sound in the city, took on a more sinister resonance, a reminder of the precariousness of their chosen world. "This world," Samuel had said to her one night, his voice strained, heavy with weariness. It doesn't want us to find harmony. It thrives on dissonance. The stark reality of her fractured existence was thrown into agonizing relief at a high-profile NOACP event. The ballroom glittered, a kaleidoscope of respectable finery and earnest ambition. Amidst the powerful speeches and grand pronouncements, Viola felt a profound sense of unreality. It was as if she were moving through a dream, a gilded charade. Then through the large arched windows she saw him. Samuel stood outside, watching from a distance, a lone figure against the glittering facade of her world. The saxophone, his constant companion, was not with him. The contrast between her two lives, the suffocating elegance within, and the raw, untamed passion embodied by the man outside was sharp and painful. The inevitable confrontation with her mother arrived like a meticulously delivered blow. Her mother, a woman of formidable will and unwavering adherence to propriety, sat across from her, her posture as rigid as Viola's own upbringing. There were no shouts, no histrionics, only a chillingly precise articulation of duty. "You carry the weight of generations, child," her mother stated, her voice devoid of warmth. "The sacrifice is made for you, the path laid for your future. Do not cast it aside for a fleeting fancy." Viola's inner monologue screamed in protest. The walls of my carefully constructed life felt as though they were closing in, each brick laid by expectation, each mortar mixed with duty. But the wild, free call of Samuel's music was a hammer against them, demanding release. The rift was no longer a subtle crack, it was a gaping chasm. The air in the Ellison drawing room, usually still and heavy with Lily of the Valley, crackled with an unspoken tension. Julian Vance, his impeccable composure only barely concealing a steely resolve, stood before Viola, holding her fate in his manicured hands. He presented his ultimatum not as a demand, but as a reasoned choice, a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. "Viola," he began, his voice measured, "our engagement, our future, it signifies more than just two individuals. It is a symbol. These bohemian interests you've cultivated, they are distracting. They invite speculation. They undermine the very principles we represent. You must sever these ties, return to the path we have charted, or our engagement, regrettably, is at an end." He framed it as a choice for the movement, for her family's legacy, for a world where their influence could truly make a difference. But to Viola, it was a choice between her life and her soul. Overwhelmed, a knot of desperation tightening in her chest, Viola sought out Samuel. She found him in his small, cluttered apartment above the jazz club, sanctuary filled with the scent of old books, lingering incense and the ghosts of countless melodies. The city hummed faintly outside, a distant, indifferent murmur, but inside the world shrank to just them. The saxophone, his silent confidant, rested on a nearby chair. Tears welled in her eyes as she confessed the immense pressure she was under, the impossible choice she faced, the weight of her family, the expectations of her community, Julian's unwavering certainty. It all pressed down on her, threatening to suffocate the burgeoning, fragile truth she had found with Samuel. Samuel listened, his dark eyes understanding, his face etched with a quiet empathy. He offered her no easy answers, no false promises of a world where their love would be readily accepted. Instead, he offered something far more profound, unwavering support, a silent strength that promised to bear witness to her struggle, whatever her decision. He picked up his saxophone, the gleaming brass warm against his fingers. He played for her, just for her, a slow, bluesy melody that was both a lament and a promise. It spoke of his heart, of the connection, and the fierce, unyielding freedom she yearned for. The notes hung in the air, a shimmering tapestry of raw emotion, a silent plea for her soul to choose its own song. The vibrating hum of the saxophone reed resonated through her, a visceral confirmation of a truth she could no longer deny. The scent of old vinyl records and Samuel's unique musky scent filled her senses, anchoring her to this moment, to him. As the music swelled a tide of raw emotion, Viola, drawn by its magnetic pull, moved closer, her hand tentatively reaching for his. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. This was not merely physical longing, but a yearning for true emotional resonance, a recognition of kindred spirits. He set his saxophone gently on the nearby chair, the sudden silence of the apartment after the music a profound punctuation mark. He pulled her into his embrace, his arms strong and protective. Their kiss was deep, searching, a release of all the unspoken words and forbidden desires that had simmered between them for weeks. His hands cupped her face, then traced the line of her neck, sending shivers through her. She responded with equal fervour, her fingers tangling in his dark, expressive hair, her body pressing closer, hungry for the warmth of him. They sank onto the worn velvet couch, the music still echoing in their minds, a private symphony of their burgeoning love. Clothes fell away, not in haste, but with a deliberate reverent slowness. Each unfastened button, a testament to their growing intimacy, to the sacred trust they were building. Skin met skin, warm and eager, a revelation in the dim light of the apartment. His touch was tender yet assured, exploring her with a profound gentleness that spoke of awe and deep affection. He kissed her collarbone, the delicate curve of her shoulder, then trailed kisses down her body, eliciting soft moans that she couldn't suppress. Viola arched into him, a silent plea, her body singing with a desire she had never known. Her own hands explored the planes of his back, the tautness of his muscles, revelling in the tactile connection. When their bodies finally joined, it was a symphony of sighs and whispers, a meeting of souls as much as flesh, a culmination of all the longing and unspoken promises. He held her close, their bodies pressed together in a rhythm that felt both timeless and new, as if their hearts were composing a private melody of trust and longing. Her fingers dug into his shoulders, her head thrown back, lost in the exquisite sensations, in the sheer, undeniable rightness of it all. It was a moment of profound emotional closeness, a quiet triumph of their shared vulnerability and burgeoning love wrapped in the warmth of mutual desire. When they gazed at each other, their eyes reflected not just passion, but a deep, soul-stirring satisfaction, the quiet triumph of finally belonging. A vibrant, hopeful dawn broke over Chicago, casting long, golden fingers across the city skyline. It was a new beginning, a poignant and deeply satisfying one, imbued with a sense of hard-won peace and authentic joy. Viola, standing before Julian Vance in her drawing room, felt the last vestiges of her old life crumbling, not with regret, but with a profound sense of liberation. The conversation was difficult, perhaps the hardest she had ever initiated, but the words flowed with a clarity she had never possessed before. She articulated her need for an authentic life, for a love that resonated with her deepest self, rather than one prescribed by expectation. Julian, though hurt, eventually accepted her decision with a stoic dignity that was characteristic of him, acknowledging perhaps that some melodies simply weren't meant to intertwine. Freed from the gilded cage of her past, Viola began to explore her own musical voice. Her classical training, once a rigid framework, now served as a foundation for a new, expansive expression. She experimented with improvisation, weaving the intricate structures of her youth with the emotional depth and raw spontaneity of jazz. She composed not for an audience of critics or society matrons, but for herself, for Samuel, for the burgeoning artist within. Perhaps she played in small, intimate venues, or perhaps her compositions simply filled the shared spaces of her new life with Samuel, each note a testament to her blossoming identity. Viola and Samuel, now open about their relationship, faced the societal repercussions with a quiet fortitude. Whispers turned to overt judgments, polite smiles hardened into disapproving stares. Yet they found strength and solace in each other, their love a powerful shield against the conventions they defied. They built a life together, challenging the norms not with defiance, but with the quiet power of their unwavering connection. Their home became a vibrant hub of creativity, filled with books, instruments, and the easy comfort of a shared life. The harmonious blend of piano and saxophone music, often flowing freely through their rooms, became the soundtrack of their existence. Years later, the evening light streamed through the window of their shared home, painting the room in hues of amber and rose. Viola sat at the piano, her fingers dancing across the keys, playing a soft, intricate melody, a new composition, born of both classical discipline and jazz improvisation. It was her own song, a testament to the journey she had undertaken. Samuel entered, drawn by the music, a silent smile playing on his lips. He approached her, his footsteps hushed, and placed his hands on her shoulders, then around her waist, resting his chin gently on her head. She leaned back into his embrace, her fingers still dancing on the keys, the comforting weight of his hand in hers a palpable presence. He kissed the curve of her neck, a tender, possessive gesture, a sounded acknowledgement of the life they had built. They didn't need words. Their connection was a palpable presence, a profound and enduring harmony. He whispered a soft compliment about her music, about her, a quiet reverence in his voice. She turned on the piano bench, their bodies aligning naturally, and they shared a slow, deep kiss. It was a kiss filled with the warmth of enduring love, quiet passion, and the profound peace of knowing they belonged together, two different chords that had found their perfect unconventional song. The sight of a blossoming spring flower pushing through concrete, a metaphor for their unlikely love, came to mind. Some songs are written in a lifetime of carefully placed notes, others are improvised in the space between heartbeats. But the truest melodies are those we discover when we dare to play a different chord. Velvet and glass. The suite at the Hotel Plaza Athénée was less a room and more a statement. It was a space designed to intimidate, with ceilings that soared to heights that made a man feel insignificant, and windows that framed a cool, indifferent Paris. The city, laid out like a map of jewels below, seemed to hold its breath. It was from this vantage point that Adrien Moreau conducted his life, a life of strategic acquisitions and calculated risks, where even beauty was a commodity to be leveraged. He stood by the window, not admiring the view, but assessing it, his reflection a sharp, tailored silhouette against the twilight. There was a tension in his shoulders that even the finest Italian wool could not conceal. He was a man accustomed to control, and the evening's arrangements had been disrupted. His usual companion for these public affairs, a woman as polished and predictable as the marble under his feet, had cancelled. An inconvenience, a logistical problem to be solved with the swift application of money. He had contacted the agency, a discreet service that catered to men of his calibre, and they had assured him of a replacement. The transaction was clean, efficient, and devoid of the messy complications of human connection. That was how Adrien preferred it. A soft chime at the door announced her arrival. He turned, his expression neutral, ready to deliver the same concise briefing he always did. But the woman who entered was not what he had expected. She was not a flicker of temporary glamour, but a stillness, a self-possession that was both startling and profound. Her name was Camille Durand, and she carried herself with the innate grace of forgotten royalty. Her dress, a simple column of dark velvet, did not shout for attention, yet it commanded it. It was her eyes, however, that held him. They were the colour of the Parisian sky just before dawn, a soft grey that seemed to hold the city's secrets. "Monsieur Moreau," she said, her voice a low melody that seemed to absorb the room's sterile opulence. "Mademoiselle Durand," he replied, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. "Your file was concise. I trust you understand the level of discretion this week requires." A small enigmatic smile touched her lips. "Discretion, Monsieur Moreau, is its own kind of art. It is like knowing the precise moment a piece of glass is ready to be shaped, and when it will shatter from the slightest pressure." The analogy was unexpected, poetic. It hung in the air between them, a strange and beautiful object. Adrian, a man who dealt in the hard currency of facts and figures, found himself at a loss. He had thought of her as an asset, a beautiful, polished line item on the week's balance sheet. Nothing more. But her words, her presence suggested a depth he had not accounted for. The corporate dinner was a battlefield of pleasantries, a place where smiles were sharpened and reputations were won and lost between the soup and the dessert. Adrian was prepared to guide her, to steer her through the treacherous currents of conversation. He was ready for the vacant nods, the feigned interest, the small social stumbles of a woman out of her depth. He was wrong. Camille moved through the evening with an effortless intelligence that was both a shield and a revelation. She listened more than she spoke, her perceptive gaze seeming to peel back the layers of carefully constructed artifice around them. She engaged the crusty old banker to their right on the nuances of 18th century architecture, her knowledge so precise and her passion so genuine that the old man was utterly charmed. She parried the flirtatious advances of a young tech billionaire with a wit as sharp and clean as a shard of ice. She was a perfect shield, deflecting the unwanted and drawing in the useful. Yet, Adrian felt strangely exposed. He was accustomed to being the most observant person in the room, but tonight he felt seen. He watched her across the table, the candlelight catching the planes of her face. She raised her wineglass to her lips, and the clink of crystal against crystal was a sharp musical note in the din of conversation. It was an ironic echo of her earlier words, a sound that seemed to hint at a hidden life, a world of fragility and fire. The scent of his own cologne, a fragrance he had chosen for its cold, authoritative scent, suddenly felt lacking, a hollow imitation of power. Beneath his feet, the polished marble floors of the restaurant felt as cold and unyielding as the life he had built for himself. Later, as they were driven back to the hotel in the silent cocoon of his limousine, he found himself studying her profile against the passing city lights. She was looking out the window, her expression unreadable. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said, the words feeling inadequate. She turned to him, her grey eyes holding his. "It was a performance," she said, not with cynicism but with a simple statement of fact. "We all have our roles to play, Monsieur Moreau." "And what is your role, Mademoiselle Durand?" he asked, the question more personal than he had intended. She smiled that same enigmatic smile. "Tonight, I was the velvet glove on your iron fist, a soft shape to distract from the hard reality of business." He had hired her to be a beautiful distraction, a temporary solution to a logistical problem. But as he looked at her now, he realised that she was not a distraction at all. She was a presence, a mystery that had unsettled the careful balance of his world. For the first time in a very long time, Adrian Moreau was intrigued. And for a man like Adrian, intrigue was a dangerous and seductive proposition. The days that followed unfolded like a series of quiet revelations. The sterile elegance of the hotel suite and the sharp-edged world of corporate dinners gave way to a more intimate Paris, a city steeped in soul and shadow. It was a Paris Adrian had forgotten existed, a city he had long since dismissed as irrelevant to his ambitions. Camille, it seemed, was reintroducing him to his own city, and in doing so she was slowly, imperceptibly reintroducing him to himself. Their first stop was the Musée Rodin, a place Adrian had not visited since a school trip decades ago. He had remembered it as a dusty collection of statues, but with Camille, it became a sanctuary of captured passion. She moved through the gardens with a quiet reverence, her gaze lingering on the taut muscles of a bronze figure, the desperate embrace of two lovers carved from unyielding marble. "He didn't sculpt stone," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as they stood before the kiss. "He sculpted the air between them, the longing, the space that is about to be filled." Adrian found himself silenced by her words. He was a man who understood value, who could put a price on anything. But as he listened to Camille speak of art, of the tension in the marble and the passion captured in bronze, he realized that he had no currency for this kind of understanding. He saw not an escort, but a scholar, an artist. He saw a woman who understood the language of beauty in a way he never had. Later that afternoon, he found her on a small private balcony of the hotel, away from the sterile perfection of the suite. She was sketching in a small worn charcoal sketchbook, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was an unguarded moment, a glimpse behind the flawless facade she presented to the world. He felt like an intruder on something sacred. "What are you drawing?" he asked softly, not wanting to startle her. She didn't look up, her fingers continuing to move across the page with a practiced grace. "The way the light remembers the stone," she said simply. He looked out at the rooftops of Paris, at the play of late afternoon sun on the ancient buildings. He had always seen the city as a collection of assets, a portfolio of real estate. But through her eyes, it became something more, something alive. He saw the history in the stones, the stories the light told as it moved across the city. He saw poetry. That evening, a sudden downpour trapped them in the car on their way to another business dinner. The rain fell in sheets, blurring the city lights and creating a cocoon of quiet intimacy. The rhythmic drumming on the roof was the only sound between them. The pretense of their arrangement, the careful distance Adrian had maintained, seemed to dissolve in the rain-streaked darkness. He found himself speaking of things he had never shared with anyone, not even his closest confidants. He spoke of a past business partner, a man he had once considered a friend who had betrayed him in a way that had left him emotionally bankrupt. The betrayal had been a brutal lesson, one that had taught him to trust only in assets, not in people. It was the moment he had begun to build the fortress around his heart. Camille listened, her silence more comforting than any words of sympathy he had ever received. She did not offer platitudes or easy reassurances. She simply listened, her gaze steady and compassionate. In her eyes, he did not see judgment or pity. He saw understanding. "You speak in riddles, Camille," he said, a note of frustration in his voice as he tried to break through her elegant deflections. "In poetry." She looked out at the rain-streaked window, at the city that was both their prison and their sanctuary. "And you, monsieur, speak only in contracts," she replied softly. "Perhaps we are both translating a language the other has forgotten." The words struck him with the force of a revelation. He looked at her, at the woman who wore couture-like armour, but whose eyes held the sadness of a forgotten history. He realised that he didn't want their arrangement to end. He wanted more time to unravel the mystery of Camille Durand. "I need you for the rest of the week," he said, the excuse of business sounding flimsy even to his own ears. "There are other engagements." She turned to him, a faint smile on her lips. She knew, he realised. She knew that this was no longer about business. It was about something else entirely, something that was both terrifying and exhilarating. As she reached out to steady herself as the car turned a corner, her hand brushed against his arm. The touch was fleeting, but the warmth of her skin, the surprising connection in that simple gesture sent a jolt through him. It was a warmth that he had not realised he had been so desperately missing. the gritty texture of charcoal dust on her fingertips, the rhythmic drumming of the rain, the surprising warmth of her hand. These were the sensory anchors of a deepening connection, a connection that was slowly, surely, breaking down the walls he had so carefully constructed. He was a man who had built his empire on the bedrock of control, but with Camille, he was beginning to understand the beautiful, terrifying power of surrender. The Palais Garnier was a cavern of glittering opulence, a place where dreams were spun from gold leaf and velvet. The annual charity gala was the pinnacle of the Parisian social season, a breathtaking spectacle of wealth and power. But beneath the surface of its beauty, the air was charged with a stormy Bronte-esque tension. Every smile was a calculation, every whisper a potential weapon. It was into this gilded arena that Adrian and Camille made their entrance. And they were the centre of attention, not just for Adrian's formidable reputation, but for the woman on his arm. Camille was a vision in a gown the colour of a midnight sky, a stark, elegant contrast to the frothy confections worn by the other women. She moved with a liquid grace, her head held high, her enigmatic smile a perfect shield against the prying eyes of the city's elite. For the first time, Adrian felt an undeniable, unprofessional pride. The way she held herself, the way she looked at him when he leaned in to whisper an observation in her ear, it felt real. He allowed himself, for a fleeting, dangerous moment, to believe that it was. They were a portrait of perfect harmony, a couple so exquisitely matched that they seemed to cast the rest of the room in shadow. They danced, a slow, graceful waltz that felt less like a performance and more like a private conversation. In the circle of his arms, with the music swelling around them, the world outside their embrace seemed to melt away. There was only the scent of her perfume, the warmth of her hand in his, the startling intimacy of her gaze. But the real world, with its sharp edges and cruel realities, was waiting for them just beyond the dance floor. It arrived in the form of Antoine Dubois, a man Adrian had bested in a recent business deal, a man known for his casual cruelty. He cornered them near the grand staircase, his smile a predatory slash in his handsome face. "Moreau," he said, his voice dripping with a venom that was barely disguised by the veneer of politeness, "I must commend your taste. You always did have an eye for unique acquisitions." Adrian's hand tightened on Camille's arm. He knew this man, knew the kind of damage he was capable of inflicting. "Dubois," he said, his voice cold. "I wasn't aware they allowed vultures in here." Dubois' eyes flickered to Camille, a malicious glint in their depths. He recognized her. "Ah, but this is a special occasion," he said, his voice rising, drawing the attention of those around them. "A reunion of sorts. I was just admiring your companion. She looks remarkably well, considering." He paused, savouring the moment, the growing circle of curious faces. "You always did have an eye for damaged goods, Moreau. This one shattered quite spectacularly a few years back, didn't you, chérie?" The words, spoken with such casual cruelty, landed with devastating precision. The glittering society folk who had been admiring Camille moments before now turned their gazes on her with a new predatory curiosity. Their admiration was replaced by a mixture of pity and contempt, the two emotions she had spent years trying to escape. Adrian felt Camille flinch, a barely perceptible tremor that ran through her body. He wanted to shield her, to pull her away from the poisoned glare of the crowd, but it was too late. The unmasking was complete. Dubois, revelling in his victory, delivered the final fatal blow. "Camille," he announced, his voice echoing in the sudden silence, "the celebrated glass artist. Or should I say, the formerly celebrated one. The one whose grand commission for the Beaumont Foundation, the Icarus installation, shattered so spectacularly. A tragic story of ambition and betrayal. She trusted her partner, you see. poured her soul into his designs, only for him to claim them as his own when the glass proved too fragile for her artistic temperament. He let the lie hang in the air, a perfectly crafted piece of poison. Her partner soared, and she, like Icarus, fell, a fall from grace that was almost biblical. He smiled at Camille, a smile that was all teeth. "Tell me, my dear, have you managed to pick up the pieces, or are you still selling them off one by one?" The sound of a champagne flute accidentally dropped, shattered, on the marble floor. The sharp, splintering sound a perfect echo of the devastation in Camille's eyes. The vast, echoing space of the opera house, which had felt so magical moments before, now felt cold and predatory. The blinding flash of a photographer's camera caught the single tear that escaped her eye, a diamond of grief on her perfect porcelain skin. She turned to Adrian, her face a mask of profound heartbreak. "Now," she whispered, her voice choked with a pain that seemed to tear through him. "Now you see the glass beneath the velvet." And then she was gone, a fleeting shadow in a midnight gown fleeing into the prison night, leaving him frozen amidst the wreckage of their beautiful, fragile illusion. The hours that followed were a blur of cold silence and sharp-edged regret. Adrian's hotel suite, once a symbol of his power and control, now felt like a gilded cage. The panoramic views of Paris, the city lights twinkling like a million indifferent stars, offered no comfort. He ignored the incessant buzz of his phone, the dozens of calls from his peers, his PR team, the vultures of the media who were already circling, eager to feast on the carcass of a good scandal. For the first time in his life, Adrian Moreau had no strategy, no plan. He had only a hollow ache in his chest and the echo of Camille's whispered words. "Now you see the glass beneath the velvet." He had seen it. He had seen the raw, fragile truth she had kept hidden, and he had done nothing. He'd stood frozen as the world he'd invited her into had torn her apart. Sleep was impossible. The image of her face, the profound heartbreak in her eyes, was burned into his memory. As dawn broke, casting a pale grey light over the city, a decision settled in his heart. A decision that had nothing to do with damage control or strategic retreats. He used his formidable resources, the same resources he had used to build his empire, not to spin the story, not to protect his reputation, but to find her. He found her in Montmartre, a world away from the opulent heart of Paris. Her loft was in a quiet, cobbled street, a place that felt more like a sanctuary than a home. He stood before the door, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He had faced down corporate raiders and hostile boardrooms with less trepidation. When she opened the door, he was confronted with a woman he had never seen before. Her composure was gone, shattered like the champagne flute at the gala. Her hair was unbound, a dark cloud around her shoulders. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a fragile fury. She wore a simple, paint-splattered tunic, and her hands, the hands that had so delicately held a wineglass, were calloused and capable. The loft was a space that was more soul than room. It was filled with the ambient heat of a furnace, the earthy scent of wax and charcoal. And everywhere there was glass. Breathtaking sculptures, some twisted in pain, others soaring with light. It was the diary of her hidden years, a testament to her resilience, her pain, her extraordinary talent. He finally understood. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice raw, devoid of the melody he remembered. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't try to explain the world he lived in, the cruel games that were played. He simply looked at her, at the woman who'd been so brutally exposed, and he spoke the truth. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate, yet they were all he had. "I'm sorry for my ignorance, for my world, for not seeing you sooner." He took a hesitant step into the room, his gaze sweeping over the incredible sculptures that filled the space. "I don't care about the scandal, Camille. I care about you. Her anger, the fragile shield she had erected against him, seemed to melt away, replaced by a wave of heartbroken tears. A sob, a sound of grief and relief broke from her, and she collapsed against him. He caught her, holding her, just holding her, his arms a circle of solid, unwavering support. He let her feel his presence, a silent promise that he would not let her fall. The embrace deepened, a silent language of comfort and contrition. He reached up, his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that traced a path through the charcoal dust on her cheek. The gesture, so tender, so reverent, seemed to undo her completely. He kissed her then, not with the frantic passion of a man seeking to possess, but with the profound recognition of a man who had found something precious. It was a kiss that spoke of absolution, of acceptance. It was like he was breathing her in, learning the shape of her spirit, the texture of her soul. His hands moved from her face to her back, tracing the delicate line of her spine, feeling the shivers his touch created. Clothes, the velvet armor and the tailored wool became barriers to this overwhelming need for closeness. They were shed not with haste, but with a tender deliberateness, a shedding of the final facades. Skin met skin, a silent communion in the warm, dusty air of the studio. The silent, beautiful glass sculptures around them glinted in the low light, refracting the dawn into 1,000 tiny rainbows on their skin. They were witnesses to this quiet, sacred moment. When their bodies pressed together, it was fire and fragility all at once, a dance of need and tenderness, where every sigh seemed to carry a lifetime of unspoken longing, and every touch was a silent vow. I see you. You're safe here. The intense residual heat from the glass furnace filled the room, a tangible reminder of the fire that had forged her, the fire that was now finally warming him. In the profound silence of the loft, broken only by their breathing, Adrian Moreau, the man who had built his life on the cold, hard currency of control, finally learned the redemptive power of surrender. The quiet, hopeful light of dawn filtered through the large, dusty windows of Camille's loft, turning the floating motes of dust into dancing diamonds. Adrian woke slowly, the scent of charcoal and brewing coffee mingling in the air. He was entangled in the soft, worn sheets of Camille's modest bed, her head resting on his chest, her breathing a soft, steady rhythm against his skin. The world outside, with its demands and judgments, its sharp-edged society and its relentless media, felt a universe away. He watched her sleep, the fierce artist at peace, the lines of tension around her eyes softened, her lips curved in a faint, serene smile. In the soft morning light, he saw not the disgraced artist, not the polished companion, but the woman in all her resilient, breathtaking beauty. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not return to his old life. He could not go back to a world of sterile suites and transactional relationships. He had found something real, something true, and he would not let it go. Later, after a breakfast of strong coffee and croissants from the local boulangerie, he watched her work. He stood in the corner of her studio, a silent observer, as she moved with a focused grace, her body a fluid extension of her art. She gathered molten glass from the furnace, the glory hole as she called it, a glowing incandescent ball of liquid fire. She rolled it, shaped it, her breath a steady creative force as she blew life into the formless mass. He saw the strength in her arms, the passion in her eyes, the sheer unadulterated joy she took in the act of creation. He had spent his life acquiring things, beautiful things, expensive things, but he had never witnessed the birth of beauty itself. He had seen her pain in the twisted, shattered pieces she had shown him, but now he was seeing her hope in the new fluid shapes she was creating, and he knew what he had to do. He picked up his phone, but he didn't call his lawyers or his PR team. He called Genevieve Valois, the most influential gallery owner in Europe, a woman known for her discerning eye and her disdain for the predictable. She was a woman who understood that the most compelling art often came from the most compelling stories. "Genevieve," he said, his voice firm, resolute, "have something for you, something extraordinary." A week later, Camille's studio was transformed. The organised chaos was still there, the scent of wax and charcoal still hung in the air, but now it was a curated space, the breathtaking sculptures illuminated by carefully placed lights. Adrian had not moved her art to a sterile white gallery. He had brought the art world to her. He had framed her not as a scandal, but as a brilliant artist who had returned from the wilderness, her story not a source of shame, but the very fire that had forged her unique and resilient talent. The private viewing was a quiet affair, a gathering of the city's most discerning collectors and critics. They walked through the studio, their voices hushed with awe, their gazes lingering on the sculptures that told the story of her fall and her rise. Antoine Dubois' Poison had been transformed into a powerful narrative of resilience and redemption. As the last guest departed, leaving behind a trail of hushed promises and future exhibitions, Camille turned to Adrian, her eyes shining with a light that had nothing to do with the gallery lights. "You did this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We did this," he corrected her gently. "You created the beauty. I just opened the door." She was working on a new piece, something fluid and hopeful, a swirl of blues and greens that seemed to capture the colour of the sea and the sky. Adrian stood beside her, handing her tools, an observer who'd become a participant. At a crucial moment, as she held the blowing rod, the molten glass glowing at its end, she took his hand and placed it over hers. "Feel that," she murmured, her voice a low vibration against his skin. "That's the moment of creation, the moment it can become anything." He felt the heat, the delicate balance of pressure and breath, the life force of the molten glass. It was a metaphor for their future, a collaboration, a careful shaping of something beautiful and new from the broken pieces of their pasts. She turned to him, her face illuminated by the fiery glow of the furnace. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, loving kiss that tasted of coffee and charcoal and the sweet promise of a new beginning. It was a kiss that was not about fire, but about warmth. It was not about passion, but about peace. It was a physical affirmation of their new, unbreakable bond. In the heart of Paris, a city of stone and light, they had discovered that the most beautiful things are not built, but forged in fire, from broken pieces, made whole again by the art of love. The velvet had been stripped away, revealing the glass beneath, not shattered and broken, but resilient, radiant, and more beautiful than he could have ever imagined. Reckless North. The air in Solitude Bluff, Alaska was a physical thing. It didn't just fill the lungs, it seized them, a thief of warmth and breath. Marley Quinn stepped off the rattling supply plane and into its brutal embrace, the cold a slap of reality against the flushed skin of her cheeks. She was dressed for a magazine's idea of winter, not the raw, unforgiving truth of it. Her cashmere coat, the colour of a pale sunrise, was an absurdity against the stark backdrop of snow-drowned pines and the bruised purple of the mountains that clawed at the sky. She felt the eyes on her before she saw them. They were few, but their weight was immense. A handful of figures, swathed in layers of practical flannel and down, paused their work, their gazes lingering on her expensive, impractical boots. In their silence she heard a chorus of judgments, each one a nail in the coffin of the life she had been so unceremoniously ejected from. A defensive heat, sharp and familiar, pricked at her pride. She was an exile, stripped of her name, her status, her armour of wealth. Here she was just a woman in a foolish coat, a problem waiting to happen. The hub of the town, if such a grand word could be applied to the loose collection of buildings, was a long, low structure that housed a general store, a post office and a diner under one groaning roof. A hand-painted sign, its letters faded by the relentless elements, read, "The Bluff." It was here, amidst the scent of stale coffee, sawdust, and the faint, sweet smell of curing salmon, that she found her penance. The owner, a woman named Sarah whose face was a roadmap of every harsh winter she had ever endured, sized Marley up with a look that was neither kind nor cruel, but deeply pragmatic. "The work is hard," she said, her voice a low rumble. "The pay is not. You'll stock shelves, sort mail and wash dishes. You'll be on time every time. The coal doesn't care if you have a hangover." Marley, whose life had been a masterclass in avoiding anything that resembled hard work, simply nodded. "I understand." The first test came in the form of a shipment of medical supplies, a fragile cargo destined for the small clinic at the edge of town. Marley, her hands stiff and clumsy in their thin leather gloves, carried the boxes from the plane to the storefront. She stacked them with the careless haste of someone who had never considered the consequences of a thing being dropped, leaving them exposed to the biting wind as she went back for another load. It was then that she met him. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, a man who had learned not to waste an ounce of energy. His face, weathered and tanned by the wind and sun, was a study in grim endurance. He stopped before the precariously stacked boxes, his gaze sharp and critical. He didn't look at her, not at first. He looked at her work, and in his eyes she saw her own inadequacy reflected. "City carelessness," he said, his voice low and sharp, not raised but honed to a cutting edge. He began to restack the boxes with a practiced efficiency, his movements sure and steady. Marley's defensiveness flared. "I was coming right back for them." He finally turned his eyes on her, and they were the colour of a winter sky, a pale, unforgiving blue. "The coal doesn't wait." He gestured with his chin toward the boxes. "Things freeze. People get sick. This isn't a game." He turned his back to her then, addressing Sarah, who had emerged from the store, but his voice was pitched for Marley to hear. "Another tourist playing homesteader. Let's see if this one lasts till the thaw." Marley stood frozen, the insult landing with the force of a physical blow. He looked at her not as a person, but as a problem he was already tired of solving. In that moment, she hated him with a sudden, surprising ferocity. She hated the quiet competence of his hands, the weary certainty in his eyes. She hated that he was right. Later, as she swept the wooden floors of the store, the scent of pine from the logs stacked by the stove mingling with the faint metallic tang of engine fuel that seemed to cling to everything, she heard the lonely whine of a Cessna taking off. She looked out the window to see the small plane climbing into the vast, indifferent sky, a speck of silver against the deepening twilight. She didn't know his name, but she knew the plane was his. It was the sound of his judgment, of his dismissal, flying away from her, leaving her alone in the crushing silence of the north. His name, she would learn, was Levi Hart, and in the stark, unforgiving landscape of Solitude Bluff he was a force as powerful and as dangerous as the weather itself. The air between them crackled with a chemistry as sharp and as cold as the Alaskan air, an antagonistic energy that promised either combustion or ruin. The blizzard arrived without fanfare, a silent thief in the night. One moment the sky was a canvas of stars, cold and sharp as scattered diamonds. The next, the world was gone, erased by a swirling vortex of white. The handful of residents in Solitude Bluff, bound by the unwritten laws of the North, gathered in the lodge, the only building large enough and sturdy enough to withstand the full fury of the storm. Cut off from the world, the usual social barriers began to erode, worn down by the shared vulnerability of their predicament. The storm was a great equalizer, and in the warm, firelit common room of the Solitude Bluff Lodge, a strange temporary community was forged. It was here, in the heart of the chaos, that Marley Quinn began to thaw. The defensive chip on her shoulder, the brittle pride that had been her only armour, began to melt away, revealing something unexpected beneath. Drawing on a past life of planning charity galas and society parties, she moved through the room with a surprising efficiency. She organised the dwindling supplies, her voice calm and steady as she rationed out blankets and food. She gathered the children, her face animated as she wove fantastical stories of brave explorers and magical creatures, her voice a warm thread of light in the growing darkness. From across the room, Levi Hart watched her. He had seen the city girl, the tourist playing homesteader. He'd seen the carelessness, the impracticality, but now he saw something else. He saw a woman who moved through the chaos as if she belonged in it, as if the storm outside matched something inside of her. His judgment, once so swift and so certain, began to give way to a grudging respect. Late that night, long after the others had settled into an uneasy sleep, he found her by the large window, the firelight casting flickering shadows on her face. She was watching the snow swirl against the glass, a white, hypnotic dance. He approached her, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor. He held out a thermos. "Coffee," he said, his voice a low rumble, stripped of its earlier sharpness. She took it, her fingers brushing against his. A jolt, small but undeniable, passed between them. She poured the steaming liquid into the single tin mug. The shared warmth, a small intimacy in the vast, cold emptiness of the night. They stood in a shared silence. The only sounds the crackle and scent of the birch log fire and the muffled howl of the wind, a beast held at bay by the walls of the lodge. "It has a life of its own," he said finally, his gaze fixed on the swirling snow. "The weather, you can't fight it. You have to learn to read it, to respect it." She nodded, the warmth of the coffee seeping into her bones. "I'm beginning to understand that." She hesitated, then added, her voice barely a whisper, "It's beautiful, in a terrifying sort of way." He glanced at her then, his eyes catching the firelight. For the first time he saw past the expensive coat and the city carelessness. He saw a flicker of something vulnerable, something real. "Back home," she confessed, her gaze dropping to the mug in her hands. It was possible to be in a room with 100 people and be completely, utterly alone. Here, the silence feels different, more honest. He didn't respond, but he didn't need to. In the quiet space between them, a fragile truce was formed. He saw not a tourist, but a woman wrestling with a loneliness as vast and as profound as the Alaskan wilderness. And she saw not a grim, judgmental pilot, but a man who understood the language of silence, who had found a strange sort of peace in the heart of the storm. Later, as the blizzard raged outside, Levi found himself in his own Spartan cabin, the memory of their shared silence lingering in the air. His cabin was a reflection of the man himself, tidy, functional, stripped of all but the essentials, a place of quiet contemplation, of self-imposed exile. He thought of the woman in the lodge, of the unexpected grace she had shown. He had judged her, had dismissed her. But in the heart of the storm she had revealed a strength he hadn't anticipated, a resilience that echoed the very landscape he'd come to call home. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to read the signs, to anticipate the turns of the weather. But Marley Quinn, he was beginning to realise, was a storm of a different kind, one he was entirely unprepared for. The blizzard broke as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a world scoured clean, dazzling and deceptive under a sky of brilliant brittle blue. The shared intimacy of the storm dissipated with the last of the clouds, leaving a tense, charged atmosphere in its wake. The fragile truce between Marley and Levi, forged in the firelight of the lodge, seemed to tremble in the harsh light of day. Bolstered by a newfound confidence, a sense of having weathered her first Alaskan storm, Marley felt a reckless sort of courage take root. She had been told of a pack of Arctic foxes that had been sighted near the edge of the tundra, their winter coats a thing of rare beauty. The photographer in her, a relic of a past life of idle hobbies, stirred. Ignoring the quiet warnings of the locals, the casual mentions of how quickly the weather could turn, she borrowed a snowmobile and set off, camera slung over her shoulder. The tundra was a vast, exposed expanse of white, a blank page on which the wind wrote its own merciless story. The foxes were there, a fleeting vision of silver and shadow, and for a while Marley was lost in the thrill of the chase, the click of the shutter a satisfying counterpoint to the hum of the engine. But the sky, once so clear, began to bleed at the edges, the blue deepening to a bruised purple. The wind picked up, its playful whisper turning into a mournful howl. Within minutes the world was gone, swallowed by a blinding whiteout. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Marley's bravado. Every direction looked the same, a swirling vortex of snow. The engine of the snowmobile sputtered, then died, the silence that followed more terrifying than the storm itself. She was alone, a tiny, insignificant speck in the vast, indifferent wilderness. News of her disappearance spread through Solitude Bluff with the speed of a wildfire. Every eye turned to Levi. He was the only one with a plane, the only one with a chance of finding her. But the thought of taking to the air in this weather, of flying into the teeth of the storm, was a personal hell. It was a visceral reminder of another flight, another storm, another life lost. The ghost of his partner, a memory he had tried to bury under years of rigid control and self-imposed exile, rose up, its icy fingers clutching at his heart. He stood in his hangar, the wind rattling the metal doors, the roar of the storm a mirror of the tempest in his own soul. He couldn't fly. He wouldn't. But then he saw Sarah's face, her eyes filled with a mother's terror. He saw the faces of the other townspeople, their hope a heavy, unbearable weight. And he saw Marley's face, not the reckless tourist, but the woman who had shared a mug of coffee with him in the dead of night, her voice a soft, honest whisper in the darkness. The flight was a nightmare. The Cessna, usually so steady and reliable, was tossed about like a child's toy. Ice coated the wings, the groan of the metal skin under stress a constant, terrifying chorus. Every gust of wind was a memory, every lurch of the plane a fresh wave of guilt and fear. But he flew on, his eyes scanning the blinding whiteness below, his voice a low, steady murmur as he spoke into the radio, a mantra against the screaming of the wind. He found her, a small dark shape huddled against the useless snowmobile, a splash of colour in a world of white. The relief that washed over him was a flash, a brilliant, blinding light, immediately consumed by a cold, quiet fury born of terror. Back on the ground, the warmth of the hangar a stark contrast to the frozen tundra, he confronted her. He didn't yell. His voice was low, devastating in its quiet intensity, shaking with a contained rage that was more terrifying than any shout. "That little adventure of yours," he said, his voice raw, "that feeling of being above the rules, did it feel worth it?" He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "People die up here for fun, Marley. They die because of a single stupid choice." She looked at him, her own fear and relief warring within her. She saw the anger, but she also saw something else, something deeper, a wound that was raw and bleeding. He wasn't looking at her, she realized with sickening jolt. He was looking at a ghost, and in his eyes, she was the one who had killed her. The hard, dead silence of his locked-bin door after their fight was a wall between them. a barrier of unspoken history and bitter accusation. The rift that had opened up between them was as vast and as unforgiving as the Alaskan wilderness itself, a chasm of guilt and misunderstanding that seemed impossible to cross. The fragile connection they had forged in the heart of the storm had been shattered, leaving behind only the metallic taste of fear and the bitter sting of regret. The storm that had nearly claimed Marley returned with a vengeance, a malevolent entity that seemed determined to tear Solitude Bluff from the face of the earth. The wind howled like a banshee, and the snow fell in a thick, blinding curtain. It was in the heart of this new tempest that the town's fragile thread of existence began to unravel. Sarah, the matriarch of their small community, the woman whose face was a roadmap of every Alaskan winter, collapsed in the diner, her hand clutching her chest, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. A massive coronary, the town's part-time medic announced, his voice grim. The medevac helicopter was grounded, the storm too violent for any sane pilot to attempt a flight. Every eye once again turned to Levi. He was their only hope, their only chance of getting Sarah to a hospital before it was too late. But Levi was frozen, a man trapped in the ice of his own past. He stood in his hangar, the roar of the storm outside a symphony of his deepest fears. He saw not the churning snow, but the twisted metal of a wreck, the ghostly image of a face he could never forget. He refused to fly. The ghosts of the past held him in their icy grip, and he was powerless to break free. It was Marley who found him there, his face pale and drawn in the dim light of the hangar. She had heard the news, had seen the terror in the eyes of the townspeople. She had every reason to hate him, to fear him, to leave him to his demons. But when she looked at him, she saw not the man who had accused her, but a man who was drowning in a sea of guilt and fear. She didn't plead or accuse. She didn't try to reason with him. She simply walked up to him, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach, and looked him in the eye. "She needs you," she said, her voice clear and steady, a calm anchor in the howling chaos. "And I'll be your eyes. You won't be alone." Her words, simple and direct, were a lifeline thrown into the turbulent waters of his past. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, the fearless resolve in her face. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark in the overwhelming darkness. Her presence, her unwavering belief in him, broke through the paralysis that had held him captive. He nodded, a single sharp movement of his head. The flight was a descent into a living hell. The Cessna, a fragile shell in the face of the storm's fury, was buffeted by winds that threatened to tear it apart. Ice, thick and heavy, coated the wings, the hypnotic rhythm of the ice-laden windshield wipers a counterpoint to the frantic beating of their own hearts. But they were a team. Her voice, calm and steady, called out altitudes and headings. Her eyes a second pair for him, augmenting his skill with her unwavering watchfulness. They moved as one, their voices a quiet, focused dialogue against the roar of the storm. In the claustrophobic, rattling cockpit surrounded by a churning, violent world, they became extensions of one another, two halves of a single functioning whole. They were forced to land on a remote frozen lake, the storm too intense to continue. The roar of the engine died, replaced by the howl of the wind and the groan of the plane's metal skin under stress. In the back, Sarah's breathing was soft but steady, a fragile thread of life in the overwhelming darkness. The adrenaline of the flight receded, leaving behind something raw, something intensely vulnerable. In the dim green glow of the instrument panel, Levi turned to Marley. His eyes, no longer haunted by the ghosts of the past, were filled with an emotion she had never seen before: awe. His hand, calloused and trembling slightly, came up to cup her jaw. There were no words. The kiss was a collision of gratitude, terror, and a profound, soul-deep recognition. It was not about seduction, it was about survival. He kissed her like he was breathing her in. each brush of his mouth deepening the ache in her chest. His hands traced her back, drawing shivers that left her breathless. When their bodies pressed together in the cramped space, it was fire and fragility all at once, a dance of need and tenderness, where every sigh seemed to carry a lifetime of longing. In that small, fragile space, surrounded by the fury of the storm, they found a different kind of sanctuary, a quiet harbour in the heart of the tempest. The shared warmth of their breath fogged the cold air of the cockpit, a visible sign of the life, the hope that had been rekindled between them. The storm broke as the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the eastern sky. They completed the flight, the air now still and clean, the world below a pristine blanket of white. Sarah was alive, her condition stabilized, her life a testament to their shared courage. They returned to Solitude Bluff not as a reckless heiress and a haunted pilot, but as heroes, the ordeal having burned away all artifice, all pretense. In the quiet of Levi's cabin, the air thick with the scent of fresh coffee and wood smoke, the truth, like the morning light, finally poured in. The aurora borealis, a silent dancing ribbon of green and violet, played outside his window, a celestial ballet that seemed to mirror the quiet revolution taking place within the small warm space of the cabin. He told her of the crash, his voice low and steady, stripped of the guilt that had haunted him for so long. It had been a small navigational error, his own, a moment of overconfidence in a sky he thought he knew so well. His co-pilot, his friend, had paid the ultimate price for his mistake. In return, she told him the truth of her prank, the act of reckless sabotage that had led to her exile. It had been an impulsive act, yes, but one born of a desperate, deeply moral outrage. Her father's company had been on the verge of releasing a product they knew to be faulty, dangerous. She had tried to reason with him, to appeal to his conscience, but he had dismissed her, his own daughter, as a naive child. Her act of sabotage had been a desperate attempt to be heard, to stop a wrong she could not otherwise prevent. In the soft, ethereal light of the aurora, they saw each other, finally and completely. They were not their mistakes. They were not their pasts. They were two souls who had been broken and battered, but who had found in each other a way to be whole again. The frantic energy of the storm had been replaced by a quiet so profound it felt sacred. Dawn was not yet a certainty, but a promise whispered at the edges of the sky, filtering through the window in hues of soft grey and pale lavender. In this gentle light, Levi moved toward her, and the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. He helped her out of her heavy clothes, and the act was a slow, reverent unwrapping. There was no haste, no fire of desperate need, like the one that had consumed them in the cockpit. This was something else entirely. His fingers, so sure and steady on the controls of his plane, were now deliberate and almost hesitant as they worked the buttons of her damp wool coat. The garment fell away, pooling at her feet, and with it seemed to fall the last of her defences, the armour she had worn for a lifetime. He paused at the thick sweater she wore underneath, his gaze meeting hers, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a complete and total surrender not to him, but to this moment they had earned. His touch was a revelation. His hands, calloused and mapped with the fine lines of a life lived in the wind and cold, were impossibly gentle against her skin. He traced the curve of her jaw, his thumb brushing over the place where a tear had frozen to her cheek hours before. The sensation sent a tremor through her, not of cold or fear, but of a deep, resonant ache. It was the ache of being found after being lost for so long. He followed the line of her throat, his touch lingering on the hollow where her pulse beat a steady, thrumming rhythm against his fingertips. The scene was a tapestry woven from the quietest sensations, the soft, yielding texture of a hand-knit wool blanket he drew around her shoulders, the faint, clean scent of wood smoke that clung to his shirt, a scent she now knew was the scent of safety, of home, the way the pale morning light caught in the strands of her hair, turning them to silver floss. He looked at her as if she were a new and uncharted territory, a landscape he was discovering for the first time, and he was determined to learn its every contour with a patient, loving reverence. When their bare skin finally touched, it was not a spark, but a slow spreading warmth, a current of pure recognition that flowed between them. His hands on her back were not demanding but steadying, a silent promise of support. Her hands resting on the hard planes of his chest felt the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. Their coming together was a silent conversation, a language of touch and breath, and shared glances that spoke of everything they had survived and everything that was now possible. His gaze said, "You are safe." Her touch answered, "I know." His lips, when they finally met hers again, were not the desperate seeking mouth from the storm-tossed cockpit. The kiss was soft, unhurried, a tender confirmation of the promise made in the darkness. It was about feeling seen, every fractured piece of her held and cherished in his gaze. It was about the quiet joy of a sunrise after a long and terrifying night, the profound, soul-deep peace of a ship finding its harbour after a lifetime at sea. In the quiet of the cabin, with the dawn breaking over the vast, wild north, two broken souls finally and completely became whole. Their coming together was a silent conversation, a language of touch and breath and shared glances. It was about feeling safe, seen, and utterly cherished. It was the quiet joy of a sunrise after a long, dark night. It was the peace of a harbour after a storm. Marley's period of exile was over. A letter had arrived on the supply plane, a formal, stilted apology from her father, an invitation to return to the world she had left behind. She was free to go. But as she stood at the window of Levi's cabin, the clean light of a new day flooding the small space, she realised that the home she had been searching for wasn't a place on a map. It wasn't a name or a status or a bank account. It was a feeling. It was the feeling of being seen, of being known, of being loved not in spite of her reckless heart, but because of it. In the vast wild north they had not run from their ghosts, but had learned to fly with them. They had navigated the storms, both external and internal, and had found their way to a quiet sunlit shore. They had discovered that the most reckless act of all was not to fly into a storm, or to sabotage a corrupt company, but to love without reservation, to trust without fear, to build a home not of wood and nails, but of two hearts, finally and irrevocably intertwined. The Cessna engine, once a symbol of past trauma, was now the sound of a promise, a steady, reliable heartbeat in the vast, beautiful silence of the north. And the aurora, that unpredictable, breathtaking display of light and colour, was a constant reminder of the beauty that could be found in the darkest of nights, a symbol of a hope that was as wild and as untamable as the land itself. The Orchard Letters. The spring of 1947 was a season of determined hope in Northern California. The war was a scar but a healing one, and the land, indifferent to human folly, burst forth with an almost defiant splendour. In the apple orchards of the Sonoma Valley, this splendour was a palpable presence. The air, thick with the sweet, heady perfume of blossoms, hummed with the industry of bees, a sound so constant it became a part of the silence. It was a landscape of promises, of new beginnings painted in broad strokes of pink and white against the tender green of new leaves. Yet for Leah, the beauty was a quiet torment. She moved through the rows of blossoming trees like a ghost in her own life, a slender figure in a simple cotton dress that seemed too delicate for the raw red earth of the orchard. She was beautiful, with the fine-boned elegance of her Norman ancestry, but a quiet sorrow had settled in her dark eyes, a shadow that the brilliant California sun could not dispel. Her marriage to Thomas, the man who owned these trees, this earth, was one of quiet security, not passion. He was a good man, steady and kind, a silhouette she often saw in the distance, more comfortable with the rhythms of the land than the complexities of a woman's heart. He had been a soldier, a liberator, and she, a grateful war bride. Their union was a testament to survival, a practical arrangement in a world still reeling from impractical violence. But gratitude, she was learning, was a poor substitute for love. The low drone of Thomas's tractor was the relentless metronome of her days, a sound that underscored the inescapable reality of her life. It was the sound of her cage, gilded though it was with the promise of peace and plenty. On the third day of the full bloom, a new sound intruded upon the familiar drone. A sputtering, a cough, a final resigned sigh from an engine pushed beyond its endurance. A car, a dusty Ford utterly out of place on the dirt road that bordered the orchard, had broken down. The driver, a man with kind, observant eyes and a well-worn tweed jacket, emerged and stood looking at the silent engine with a philosophical resignation. He was not a farmer, that much was clear. His hands, though not soft, were stained with ink, not earth. Thomas, ever the practical Samaritan, saw the man's plight from his perch on the tractor. He drove over, the engine's rumble a stark contrast to the sudden silence of the Ford. A brief conversation, a diagnosis of a broken fan belt, and an offer of help followed. The necessary part would have to be ordered from Santa Rosa. A journey of a day, a delivery of 2 more. "You'll stay with us," Thomas said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Hospitality in the valley was as natural as the turning of the seasons. "My wife will make up the spare room." The man introducing himself as Silas, a poet travelling the country to collect the stories of those displaced and redefined by the war, accepted with a gratitude that was both genuine and graceful. Thomas, his face ruddy with sun and satisfaction, led Silas into the heart of the orchard to introduce him to his wife. Leah was thinning the blossoms on a Gravenstein tree, her movements precise and delicate, a dance of practiced necessity. "Leah," Thomas called, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "This is Mr. Silas. He'll be staying with us for a few days. His car's given out the ghost." Leah turned, a stray blossom clinging to her dark hair. She brushed a strand from her forehead with the back of her hand and looked at the stranger. When her eyes met Silas's, a jolt, subtle yet profound, passed between them. It was not the spark of attraction, but something quieter, deeper, a startling flicker of recognition, the silent acknowledgement of 2 solitudes meeting in a crowded world. She extended her hand, and as he took it, the contrast was not lost on her. His fingers, though holding a writer's callus, were soft compared to the hardened, earth-stained hand of her husband. There was not a touch, but a question. My heart foolishly answered. "I've never seen blossoms like these," Silas said, his voice a warm, gentle tenor that seemed to belong to the quiet hum of the orchard. "They feel hopeful, as if they are making a promise they intend to keep." Leah withdrew her hand, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "They always promise more than they deliver," she said, her French accent softening the edges of her words, a melody that Silas found himself leaning into. "It is the nature of spring." Thomas, oblivious to the subtle currents passing between them, clapped his hands together. "Well, the sun's high. Let's get you settled in, Mr. Silas. Leah, I'll be in for lunch in an hour." He strode off towards the house, leaving them in a silence that was suddenly charged with unspoken things. The drone of the tractor started up again, a familiar, intrusive sound, pulling Leah back to the reality of her life. But for a moment, in the quiet gaze of the poet, she had felt the whisper of another world, a world of words and feelings she had thought long lost to her. The farmhouse kitchen was a place of warmth and order, a clean, bright space that smelled of baking bread and freshly brewed coffee. It was the heart of Leah's domain, the one place where she felt a sense of purpose, of control. But in the 2 days that followed Silas's arrival, it became something more. A sanctuary of conversation, a confessional where stories, long dormant, were brought into the light. They fell into a rhythm, an easy, unforced intimacy that seemed to exist outside the bounds of her life with Thomas. While she kneaded dough, her hands dusted with flour, he would sit at the large pine table, his journal open before him, and they would talk. She told him of her home in Normandy, of the sharp, salt scent of the sea, of the grey stones of the ancient church in her village. She spoke of the war, not in the grand sweeping terms of battles and victories, but in the small personal details of fear and survival. The rumble of distant guns, the taste of fear in the back of her throat, the way the silence after a bombing was more terrifying than the noise itself. These were things she had never spoken of to Thomas, not because he wouldn't have listened, but because he couldn't have understood. He had been a soldier, a man of action, she, a witness to the slow, creeping dread of occupation. Her French accent, which in the valley marked her as an outsider, a curiosity, became in Silas's presence a thing of beauty, a cadence that lent a poetic weight to her words. In return, he read to her from his journal. They were not poems of grand passions or epic landscapes, but quiet observations of the people he had met on his travels, sketches of lives upended by the war, of hope and resilience in the face of loss. His words gave voice to the unspoken loneliness he saw in the heart of post-war America, and in doing so they gave voice to her own. He saw the world not as a series of events, but as a collection of stories, each one precious, each one worthy of being told. "To speak of it," she said one afternoon, her voice barely a whisper as she watched the steam rise from her coffee cup. "It makes it real again, the home I left. Perhaps it is good to be reminded of what was real." He looked at her, his gaze gentle, understanding. "It's the only thing that is real," he said, "the stories we carry inside us." Their awareness of each other was a constant, palpable presence, a current that flowed between them, as real and as invisible as the scent of the apple blossoms that drifted in through the open kitchen window. He watched her hands as she kneaded the bread, the sure rhythmic movement of her fingers. She watched his face as he listened to the evening birds from the porch, the way the setting sun caught the silver in his hair. They walked in the orchard, the petals falling around them like a soft, fragrant snow, their shoulders almost brushing, the space between them charged with a silent, unspoken longing. "She moves with the grace of someone trying not to break the silence," he wrote in his journal, late one night, the light of a single lamp casting a golden glow on the page. "I am beginning to understand that her silence is a language all its own." Thomas remained a benign, distant presence. His days were consumed by the demands of the orchard, his evenings by a quiet, exhausted sleep. He was a good man, a kind husband, and he saw nothing but a simple country hospitality in the quiet conversations between his wife and their guest. He was a man of the earth, and the subtle, unspoken language of the heart was a foreign tongue to him. On the second evening, as dusk settled over the valley, painting the sky in shades of lavender and rose, they walked to the highest hill of the orchard. From there, they could see the entire valley spread out before them, a patchwork of green and gold under the vast open sky. The sound of crickets filled the air, a gentle, insistent chorus that seemed to be the soundtrack of their quiet confessions. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft with a wonder that was tinged with sadness. "Yes," he said, his eyes not on the valley, but on her face illuminated by the last fading light of day. "It is." In that moment, on that hill, with the world spread out at their feet, the unspoken thing between them was as vast and as real as the sky above. It was a connection forged in the quiet spaces between words, a bond of shared solitude that was as profound as it was impossible. On the third day the weather turned. A sudden, unseasonable storm rolled in from the coast, the sky darkening from a hopeful blue to a bruised, angry purple. The air grew heavy, electric, charged with an impending violence that mirrored the unbearable tension that had taken root in the farmhouse. The news arrived with the morning mail, a small greasy package from the auto parts store in Santa Rosa. The fan belt. Silas announced at breakfast that he would be leaving in the morning. The words, simple and expected, hung in the air like the heavy, unfallen rain, and the easy intimacy of the past 2 days shattered. Leia felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She had known this moment was coming, had braced herself for it, but the reality of it was a physical blow. She went about her morning chores in a daze, the familiar rhythm of her life suddenly alien and meaningless. The scent of the apple blossoms, now heavy with the coming rain, seemed cloying, suffocating. That evening at dinner, the chasm between her life and her longing became a vast, unbridgeable gulf. Thomas, in a rare expansive mood, spoke of crop yields and weather patterns, of the price of apples and the threat of blight. His talk was of the earth, of the practical, tangible world he inhabited, with such simple, unquestioning certainty. It was a world of facts and figures, of seasons and cycles, a world that had no room for the poetry and feeling that had become Leia's sustenance for 2 short, miraculous days. Silas, too, seemed a stranger, his easy warmth replaced by a polite, formal distance. He spoke of his travels, of the road ahead, of the stories he had yet to collect. He was a man in motion, a bird of passage, and she, a rooted tree destined to remain in this small, circumscribed world. The mundane conversation was a torment, each word a reminder of the life she was bound to, the life she had, for a brief, intoxicating moment, forgotten. Overwhelmed, she excused herself, the half-eaten food on her plate a testament to the sudden, bitter loss of appetite. She went to her room and stood at the window, watching the rain lash against the panes, blurring the world outside into a wash of grey and green. The storm hadn't yet broken, but in the electric air, her own carefully constructed composure had. She was mourning the loss of something she had never been allowed to have, a grief that felt both immense and illegitimate. How does one say goodbye to a dream that was never truly yours? The house was filled with an oppressive silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof and the distant mournful howl of the wind. Each drop that streaked down the window pane was a tear she could not shed, each gust of wind a sigh she could not release. He will leave, the blossoms will fall, and I will still be here. The thought was a cold, hard stone in her chest, a weight she knew she would carry for the rest of her days. Sleep was an impossibility. The storm outside was a pale reflection of the tempest in Leia's heart. The rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof was a maddening, relentless reminder of the passing hours, each one bringing Silas's departure and the return to her silent, passionless life closer. Unable to bear the confines of her room, the suffocating weight of her own thoughts, she rose and, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, slipped out of the house. The old barn, a cavernous space that smelled of hay and rain and the warm animal scent of horses, was her sanctuary. It was a place of quiet solitude, of simple, uncomplicated existence. She sought its familiar comfort now, a balm for her wounded spirit. The great doors were open to the night, and in the frame of their opening a silhouette stood against the storm-tossed sky. Silas. He was watching the storm, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slumped in a posture of weary resignation. He had not heard her approach, and for a long moment she stood in the shadows watching him, her heart aching with a love that was as hopeless as it was profound. He must have sensed her presence, for he turned, and in the dim, uncertain light their eyes met. The pretense that had held them apart for 3 days dissolved in that shared gaze. The look in his eyes held all the words they had not said, all the feelings they had not dared to acknowledge. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice a mere whisper against the sound of the storm. "Nor I," he replied, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to conceal. He took a step towards her, then another, until he was standing before her, so close she could feel the warmth of his body, see the rain clinging to his eyelashes. "In 3 days," he said, his voice low and intense, "you have made me feel more at home than I have in my entire life." The confession, so simple, so direct, undid her. The tears she had held back for so long welled in her eyes, and she could not stop them. "And you," she whispered, her voice breaking, "you have made me feel seen, truly seen, for the first time since the war." He stepped toward her and took her hand. The touch was not a prelude to passion, but a confirmation of it. He gently pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin with a reverence that made her tremble. "Leia," he whispered, and her name on his lips was a poem in itself. He lowered his head, and the kiss was achingly soft, a taste of rain and salt and sorrow. But the sorrow deepened into something else, a desperate, undeniable need. The kiss changed, becoming not a farewell, but a claiming of this one stolen moment. Her hands, which had rested tentatively on his chest, now gripped the rough wool of his coat, pulling him closer. He led her away from the open doors, away from the watching storm, into a quiet corner of the barn where the lantern cast a soft golden glow low on the piled hay. The world narrowed to this small sacred space, to the sound of their breathing and the rhythmic drum of rain on the tin roof. Her shawl fell from her shoulders, pooling at her feet. His coat followed, shrugged off and forgotten. There was no haste, only a deep mutual reverence, a slow, deliberate unwrapping of the layers that separated them. His fingers found the sheer lace of her nightgown, and she shivered not from cold, but from the profound intimacy of the act. The simple cotton gave way, and his hands, the hands of a poet, traced the curve of her back, learning her as if she were a verse he had longed to write. She met his touch with a quiet surrender, her own hands exploring the warm, solid plains of his chest. It was a silent conversation, a language of touch that spoke of longing, of loneliness, of a connection so deep it defied words. He lowered her gently into the sweet-smelling hay, the rough strands a stark contrast to the softness of her skin. In the flickering lantern light he looked at her, his eyes full of a tenderness that made her heart ache. This was not a taking, but a giving, a shared solace. For one night they were not a farmer's wife and a wandering poet. They were simply a man and a woman, finding in each other a brief, perfect home. Their coming together was a quiet prayer answered in the dark, a fusion of two lonely souls into a single fleeting moment of grace. It was a perfect, painful and complete memory, forged in the heart of a storm to last a lifetime. Dawn arrived, washed clean and brilliant after the storm. The air, scrubbed of its melancholy, smelled of wet earth and the sweet bruised fragrance of the apple blossoms. Every leaf, every petal, held a single perfect drop of water that caught the morning sun and shattered it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Silas's departure was a study in polite, painful necessity. In the bright, unforgiving light of morning, under the watchful and knowing gaze of Thomas, they exchanged the formal, empty words of strangers, a handshake, a nod, a final fleeting glance that held a universe of unspoken things, and then he was gone. He got into his car, the engine turning over with a new healthy roar, and drove away without looking back. Leia watched until the car was a mere speck of dust on the horizon, the scent of wet blossoms clinging to the air like a final fading kiss. Decades later, the scent of old paper and dried ink filled the sun-drenched attic of the farmhouse. Claire, Leia's granddaughter, a young woman with her grandmother's dark, thoughtful eyes, knelt on the dusty floorboards, a small wooden chest open before her. The house was empty now, Leah and Thomas long gone, the orchard sold to a neighbouring vineyard. Claire had come to sort through the remnants of their lives, the tangible echoes of a past she had only known through stories. Inside the chest, tied with a faded blue ribbon, was a stack of letters. They were written on thin airmail paper, the ink faded to a soft sepia brown. The handwriting was elegant, sloping, the words a beautiful, precise script. They were addressed not to a person, but to a place, a memory, to the one I couldn't have. Claire, her heart pounding with a sudden inexplicable sense of discovery, opened the first letter. It was from Silas, dated a week after he had left the orchard. She read his words, his voice echoing across the decades, and the secret heart of her grandmother, a woman she had known only as a quiet, gentle presence, was laid bare. The final intimacy between Leah and Silas was not physical but textual, a communion across time, witnessed at last by the one person who could understand its profound and silent beauty. Claire read the letters one after another, a testament to a love that had existed outside of time and circumstance, a love that had been kept alive in the quiet, secret spaces of the heart. He wrote to Leah of his travels, of the people he met, the stories he collected. But always he circled back to their 3 days in the orchard, to the scent of the blossoms, the sound of her voice, the quiet, profound connection that had redefined his world. He wrote of seeing a woman with her hair, of hearing a laugh that reminded him of hers, of the way the world in its vast and varied beauty was but a pale reflection of the beauty he had found in her. The letters were a testament to an enduring private devotion, a love that had asked for nothing and had been given everything. The final letter, written 40 years later, was penned in the wavering, uncertain hand of an old man. His memory, he wrote, was failing him, the edges of his life blurring into a soft, indistinct haze. But the image of her in the orchard, surrounded by blossoms, her face illuminated by the setting sun, remained as clear and as vivid as the day he had left. It was the one true and unchanging thing in a life of constant motion, the still point in his turning world. Claire, her own eyes now filled with tears, looked out the attic window at the neat, orderly rows of grapevines that had replaced the wild, untamed beauty of the apple orchard. She thought of her grandmother, of the quiet, unspoken sorrow she had sometimes glimpsed in her eyes, and she understood. Some loves are not meant for a lifetime, they are meant for a moment, and in that moment they give us a lifetime of meaning. The orchard was gone, but the letters remained, a legacy of unspoken passion, a testament to the quiet rebellions of the heart and the loves we keep alive in silence.